The dust devil that swept through Abilene, Kansas, that scorching July afternoon in 1874 carried more than just prairie dirt. It carried the desperate cries of a woman in labor. And those cries would change everything for a lone cowboy named James Hartley, who had sworn off love after watching his parents' marriage crumble under the weight of too many mouths to feed. James had been watering his horse at the trough outside the general store when he heard the commotion coming from the boarding house across the dusty street. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor, was frantically waving her arms and calling for help, her voice cutting through the lazy afternoon heat like a knife through butter. Without thinking, James dropped the reins and sprinted toward the building, his boots kicking up clouds of dust with each heavy step. He took the stairs 2 at a time, following the sound of anguished screams to a small room at the end of the hallway where a young woman lay writhing on a narrow bed, her face pale and slick with sweat. The midwife, old Doc Patterson's wife Martha, looked up with relief flooding her weathered features. "Thank the Lord. I need someone strong. This baby is coming whether we're ready or not, and I need you to hold her steady while I work." James hesitated for only a heartbeat before moving to the bedside, his large calloused hands awkwardly hovering near the woman's shoulders. She was younger than he had expected, probably no more than 22 or 23, with auburn hair plastered to her forehead and eyes the color of creek water after a spring rain. Those eyes fixed on him now with a mixture of pain and something else he could not quite name, a deep, bone-weary sadness that seemed to go beyond the physical agony she was enduring. "What's your name?" he asked softly, trying to distract her as Martha worked between contractions. The woman's fingers dug into his forearm with surprising strength, her nails leaving half-moon impressions in his sun-bronzed skin. "Catherine," she gasped out between clenched teeth. "Catherine Mills. My husband, he left me here 2 months ago, said he'd be back with money from a cattle drive." Her laugh was bitter and broken. Guess he found something better than a pregnant wife and an empty wallet. James felt anger flare hot in his chest, the kind of righteous fury that made men do stupid things, but he pushed it down and focused on Catherine's face instead. "Well, Catherine Mills, I'm James Hartley, and I'm going to make sure you and this baby get through this just fine. You hear me?" She nodded weakly, and then another contraction hit, and there was no more room for words, only primal sounds and Martha's steady instructions and James's own voice murmuring encouragement that surprised him with its tenderness. The afternoon stretched into evening, and the room grew stifling despite the open window that let in the occasional breath of hot wind. James lost track of time, lost track of everything except Catherine's labored breathing, and the way her hand gripped his like. He was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and uncertain. When the baby finally came, slipping into the world with an indignant wail that made Martha laugh with relief, James found himself laughing too, his eyes stinging with something that might have been tears or might have been sweat or might have been something he had no name for. "A boy," Martha announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean cloth. "A healthy, strong boy." She placed the baby in Catherine's arms, and James watched as the new mother's face transformed, all the pain and exhaustion melting away to reveal something luminous and fierce and beautiful. But then, just as quickly, Catherine's expression crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks, mixing with the sweat and dampening the collar of her nightgown. "I can't have more children after this one," she cried, her voice breaking on each word. Martha had stepped away to clean her instruments, so it was James who leaned closer, confused and concerned. Catherine looked up at him with those creekwater eyes now swimming with tears. "Martha told me before you arrived, there were complications. My body, it won't survive another pregnancy. This is my only chance at being a mother, and I'm doing it alone." The devastation in her voice cut through James like a dull blade, slow and agonizing. He should have left then. Should have backed away, mumbled some polite congratulations, and returned to his simple life of cattle and campfires. and the wide-open prairie where a man's only company was his horse and his thoughts. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Something in the way Catherine held that baby like he was the most precious thing in the entire world. Something in the way she looked at James, as if hoping he might have an answer to a question she had not yet asked. "One is enough for me," James heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere deep in his chest, somewhere he had kept locked away for years. Catherine's tear-filled eyes widened, searching his face for meaning, for sincerity, for something she desperately needed to find. "I'm in it," he continued, his voice steady despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. "I've seen families torn apart by too many children and not enough food. I've watched mothers work themselves to death trying to care for a dozen kids while their husbands drank away what little money they had. One child, loved and cared for proper, that's worth more than a dozen raised in chaos and want." Martha cleared her throat pointedly, but there was a knowing smile on her weathered face as she bustled about the room. "Mr. Hartley, perhaps you should let Mrs. Mills rest now. She's been through quite an ordeal." But Catherine's hand shot out, catching James's sleeve before he could step away. "Please," she whispered, "don't go yet. I can't be alone right now." So James stayed, settling into the hard wooden chair beside the bed while Catherine drifted in and out of exhausted sleep, the baby nestled in the crook of her arm. As darkness fell over Abilene and the sounds of the town settling in for the night drifted through the window, James found himself studying Catherine's face in the lamplight, memorizing the curve of her cheek and the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her skin. He had not planned on this. Had not planned on feeling this pull toward a woman he had just met, toward a baby that was not his own, toward a future he had convinced himself he did not want. But life on the frontier had a way of making fools of even the most careful plans. When Catherine woke in the deep hours of the night, James was still there. She blinked at him in surprise as if she had expected him to vanish like a fever dream. "You stayed," she murmured, her voice hoarse from screaming. James nodded, suddenly self-conscious about his dusty clothes and unshaven jaw. "Figured you might need something, water or food or I don't know, just seemed wrong to leave you alone." Catherine shifted carefully, wincing at the movement, and looked down at her sleeping son. "I named him Thomas," she said softly, "after my father. He died when I was 16 and my mother passed the following winter. I married Daniel, my husband, because I thought I needed someone to take care of me. Turns out I was just trading one kind of loneliness for another." Her laugh was soft and self-deprecating. "Now here I am, a mother with no husband, no family, and no prospects. Martha says I can stay here for another week, but after that, I need to figure something out. I have a little money saved, but not enough to last more than a few months." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What did you do before? Before you married, I mean." Catherine's face brightened slightly. "I was a seamstress. A good one, actually. I can make patterns from nothing and fix just about any garment you can imagine. My mother taught me, and I worked in a dress shop in St. Louis before Daniel convinced me to head west with him." She paused, looking at James with cautious hope. "Do you think there might be work for a seamstress in Abilene?" "I think there's work for a good seamstress just about anywhere," James replied. "Mrs. Chen, who runs the laundry, has been complaining for months about needing someone who can do alterations and repairs. And half the women in town sew their own dresses because there's no one skilled enough to hire. You'd have customers lining up before you even hung a sign." He saw the hope kindle in Catherine's eyes, saw her shoulders straighten despite her exhaustion. I could talk to Mrs. Chen for you, introduce you proper once you're feeling stronger. Why are you helping me?" Catherine asked suddenly, her gaze direct and unflinching. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why would you stay here all night and offer to help me find work?" James was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the honest answer. "Because when I was 12 years old, my mother had her 7th child. She bled for 3 days afterward and never really recovered. My father kept her pregnant nearly every year after that, and each time she got a little weaker, a little more like a ghost. By the time she had her 10th baby, she didn't even have the strength to hold him. She died when I was 17, and my father didn't even have the decency to look sad at her funeral. Catherine's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were not for herself. "James," she whispered, and his name on her lips sent a shiver down his spine despite the summer heat. "That's why you said one is enough." He nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "A woman shouldn't have to destroy herself to prove she's a good mother. And a child deserves parents who have enough love and energy to actually raise them right. You're Thomas there. He's lucky. He's got a mother who already loves him more than life itself. That's worth more than 10 siblings and a worn-out mama who can barely remember their names." The baby stirred then, making small mewling sounds, and Catherine lifted him to her breast with practiced ease that surprised James until he remembered she had been pregnant for months, probably reading every book and talking to every mother she could find. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked as she settled Thomas to nurse. "I'd like to talk more, about everything. If you want to, I mean. I know you probably have work and other obligations." James stood, his muscles stiff from sitting so long in the hard chair. "I work the Chambers Ranch north of town, but I can come by in the evening after my shift. And I'll talk to Mrs. Chen tomorrow, see about getting you an introduction." He paused at the door, looking back at Catherine and the baby, at the picture they made in the soft lamplight. "You're going to be just fine, Catherine Mills. Both of you." As he walked out into the cool night air, James knew with absolute certainty that he had just told the truth, and that he intended to do everything in his power to make sure it stayed true. The next day dragged by with agonizing slowness. James mucked stalls and mended fences and helped move a herd from one pasture to another, but his mind was miles away, back in that small room at the boarding house. His fellow ranch hands noticed his distraction and ribbed him mercilessly about it over lunch, but James just smiled and kept his thoughts to himself. When the sun finally began its descent toward the horizon, he cleaned up as best he could, borrowed a bar of soap from the bunkhouse, and scrubbed his face and hands until they were raw and clean misses. Chen was skeptical at first when James explained the situation, but her expression softened when he mentioned Catherine's skills and circumstances. "Bring her by next week when she's recovered enough to walk," the older woman said in her crisp, accented English. "I'll give her a test. If she's as good as you say, we can work something out. I can't pay much, but it would be steady work and she can bring the baby with her. I had 5 children myself. I know how it is for a new mother." Armed with this good news, James stopped by the general store and bought a small bag of peppermint sticks, the kind his own mother used to love, before heading to the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson answered his knock with a knowing smile that made his ears burn. "She's been asking about you all day," the older woman said with poorly concealed amusement. "Room's the same as yesterday. Go on up." Catherine was sitting up in bed when James entered, looking considerably better than she had the previous day. Her hair was brushed and braided over one shoulder, and there was color in her cheeks. Thomas was sleeping in a makeshift cradle that Mrs. Henderson must have provided, and Catherine's face lit up when she saw James. "You came back," she said, and there was such genuine delight in her voice that James felt his chest tighten. "Of course I came back. I said I would, didn't I?" he told her about Mrs. Chen, and Catherine's eyes grew bright with excitement and relief. "Oh, James, that's wonderful." "I can't thank you enough. I was so worried. I kept thinking about what would happen when my money ran out, about how I'd care for Thomas." She reached out, and James found himself crossing the room to take her hand in his. Her fingers were long and elegant, marked with the small scars and calluses of someone who worked with needles and thread. "You're a good man, James Hartley. I don't know what I did to deserve your help, but I'm grateful for it." They talked as the evening light faded, trading stories about their lives, their dreams, their disappointments. James learned that Catherine had wanted to open her own dress shop someday, that she loved thunderstorms and hated the taste of coffee, but drank it anyway because it was what grown-ups did. Catherine learned that James had a younger sister back in Missouri who he had not seen in 3 years, that he played the harmonica but was too shy to perform in front of anyone, that he had once wanted to be a schoolteacher but could not afford the education. "Play for me," Catherine said suddenly. "The harmonica." "Please." James hesitated, then pulled the small instrument from his pocket, feeling foolish and exposed. But when he lifted it to his lips and began to play, a slow, sweet melody his mother had hummed while she worked, Catherine's face grew soft and dreamy. When he finished, she was wiping tears from her eyes. "That was beautiful," she whispered. "Your mother would be proud." Over the following week, James visited every evening, and each time he found it harder to leave. He watched Catherine grow stronger day by day, watched Thomas begin to focus his eyes and make small, grasping motions with his tiny hands. He helped Catherine practice walking around the room, lending his arm for support, and felt absurdly proud when she made it to the window and back without assistance. On the 8th day, Catherine met with Mrs. Chen and James waited anxiously outside the laundry, pacing back and forth until the door opened and Catherine emerged with a radiant smile. "She hired me," Catherine announced, practically dancing despite her lingering weakness. "She gave me 3 dresses to alter as a test, and if I do well, she'll give me regular work." "Oh, James." Without thinking, she threw her arms around his neck, and James found himself holding her, breathing in the scent of lavender soap and milk and something uniquely Catherine. When she pulled back, both of them were blushing, but neither looked away. "I should find a place to live," Catherine said, suddenly practical. "Mrs. Henderson has been kind, but I can't stay at the boarding house forever, especially once I start working. I need somewhere I can set up a sewing area, somewhere with good light." James had been thinking about this very problem for days. "There's a small house on the edge of town," he said carefully. "Belongs to old Mr. Tucker, but he moved in with his daughter last month. He's been looking to rent it out cheap to someone who'll take care of the place. It's got 2 rooms and a good stove, and the front room has big windows, plenty of light for sewing." They went to see the house the next day, and Catherine fell in love with it immediately. It was small and needed some work, but the bones were good, and James could already see how it would look with curtains in the windows and Catherine's sewing supplies set up by the light. Mr. Tucker, a whiskered old man with kind eyes, quoted a price that made Catherine's face fall, but James quickly intervened. "I could fix up that sagging porch and replace the loose boards on the back steps," he offered. "And I notice your barn could use some repair work. What if I do that in exchange for lowering the rent?" Mr. Tucker agreed, and suddenly Catherine had a home. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. James spent every spare moment working on the house, and Catherine, still recovering but determined to help, cleaned and organized and made the small space into a real home. Other townspeople, hearing about Catherine's situation, donated furniture and dishes and linens. Mrs. Chen provided fabric scraps for curtains, and Martha Patterson brought over a proper cradle for Thomas. By the time Catherine moved in, the house looked like it had been lived in and loved for years. James built shelves for her sewing supplies and installed a better lock on the front door. He fixed the stove so it heated evenly and patched the roof where it had been leaking. And through it all, he and Catherine talked about everything and nothing, about the past and the future, about dreams that seemed impossible and hopes that felt suddenly within reach. One evening, as they sat on the newly repaired porch watching the sun set over the prairie, Catherine turned to James with a serious expression. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I'm falling in love with you, James Hartley. I know it's too soon, and I know I have no right to put this burden on you, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel it. Every time you smile at me, every time you hold Thomas or play your harmonica or just sit quietly beside me, I fall a little more." And if you don't feel the same way, I need you to tell me now before I make an even bigger fool of myself." James felt like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He looked at Catherine, brave, beautiful Catherine who had survived abandonment and childbirth, and the news that she could never have more children, who had picked herself up and built a new life with nothing but determination and skill, and the help of a stranger who had become so much more than that. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been in love with you since that first night when you held Thomas and cried, and I realized I'd do anything to make sure you never had to face the world alone again." He stood and pulled her to her feet, cradling her face in his hands. "I meant what I said that night. One child is enough for me. Thomas is enough for me. You are enough for me. More than enough. You're everything." Then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Catherine kissed him back with equal tenderness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Catherine was crying again, but these were tears of joy. "Marry me," James said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "I know it's fast, and I know you're technically still married to that bastard who left you, but we can figure out the legal parts. I want to be Thomas's father. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to build a life with you, Catherine Mills, if you'll have me." Catherine laughed through her tears, nodding so hard her braid bounced. "Yes," she said. "Yes, yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." The practical matters took time to sort out. Catherine wrote to the county where she had married Daniel, requesting information about annulment or divorce. In the meantime, she and James courted properly, or as properly as two people hopelessly in love could manage. James moved into the small barn behind Catherine's house, insisting on propriety even though everyone in town knew they were planning to marry. He continued working at the Chambers Ranch while Catherine built her seamstress business, and slowly, steadily, they built a life together. Thomas thrived, growing plump and happy under his mother's loving care. James took to fatherhood like he had been born for it, walking the floor with the baby when he fussed, making silly faces to earn toothless grins, singing lullabies in his rough cowboy voice. Catherine would watch them together, her heart so full she thought it might burst, and thank whatever fate had brought this good man into her life at her darkest moment. The legal response came 4 months later. Daniel Mills had been found working on a ranch in Colorado, and when presented with divorce papers, he had signed them without contest or comment. The news should have hurt, Catherine thought, but instead she felt only relief and a sense of closure. That chapter of her life was finished, and a new one was beginning. They were married on a crisp October afternoon in the small church at the center of town. Catherine wore a dress she had made herself, pale blue with delicate white embroidery, and carried wildflowers that James had picked that morning. James wore his best suit, borrowed from Mr. Chambers, and could not stop grinning like a fool. Thomas, nearly 4 months old, was held by Martha Patterson during the ceremony, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the baby let out a happy gurgle that made the small congregation laugh. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Mrs. Chen provided food and someone brought a fiddle, and they danced in the street as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold. James held Catherine close, marveling at how his life had changed in just a few short months. "Happy," he murmured into her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied, tilting her face up for a kiss. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Money was tight, and there were nights when they ate nothing but beans and cornbread. Thomas got sick with a fever that terrified them both until it broke 3 days later. Catherine's seamstress business had slow periods, and James's wages from the ranch barely covered their basic needs. But through it all, they had each other, and that made every hardship bearable. James proved to be everything Catherine had hoped for and more. He was patient and kind, quick to help with Thomas and the household chores, always ready with a joke or a song when times got hard. He never complained about their small house or simple meals. never looked at other men's families with envy or regret. And at night, when they lay together in their narrow bed, he would hold her close and whisper how lucky he was, how grateful, how deeply and completely in love. Catherine flourished too, her confidence growing along with her reputation as a skilled seamstress. She took on more clients, saving every penny she could spare. She taught herself new techniques from books ordered from back east, experimented with different fabrics and styles. And she loved James with a fierceness that sometimes surprised her, this man who had chosen her and Thomas when he could have had any woman in town, who never once made her feel less than whole because she could not give him more children. On Thomas's first birthday, they had a small celebration with their closest friends. The baby smashed a tiny cake that Catherine had made, getting frosting in his hair and all over his face, and everyone laughed and took turns holding him. James gave a little speech, his voice thick with emotion, about how this past year had been the best of his life, how watching Thomas grow had been a privilege beyond measure. "One child," he said, raising his glass of cider, "loved and cherished and given every opportunity we can provide. That's worth more than any empire or fortune. To Thomas, and to the mother who brought him into this world, and to all of us who get to watch him grow." Later that night, after their guests had gone home and Thomas was sleeping soundly in his cradle, Catherine found James sitting on the porch, looking up at the stars. She settled beside him and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Taking on a ready-made family, not having the chance to start fresh with someone who could give you children of your own." James turned to look at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Catherine, listen to me. Thomas is my son in every way that matters. I was there when he took his first breath. I've been there for every milestone since, and I'll be there for everyone to come. And you're the love of my life. I don't regret a single thing, and I never will. Do you understand?" Catherine nodded, blinking back tears. "I just needed to hear it again. I needed to be sure." "I'll tell you every day for the rest of our lives if that's what it takes," James promised, kissing her temple. "You're stuck with me, Mrs. Hartley, you and Thomas both." Catherine laughed and kissed him properly, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they finally went to bed that night, wrapped around each other in the darkness, she felt a peace she had never known before, a certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The seasons turned, and their life together deepened and grew richer. James was promoted to foreman at the Chambers Ranch, which came with a significant raise in pay. Catherine's seamstress business became so successful that she had to turn away clients, and she began training a young woman named Sarah as an apprentice. They saved money carefully, planning for Thomas's future, for a time when they might be able to buy their own piece of land. Thomas grew into a bright, curious toddler who looked more like his mother every day, but had adopted James's mannerisms and expressions. He called James Papa from the moment he could talk, and James's face would light up every single time like it was the first. The boy was spoiled with love but not with things, taught to be polite and kind and respectful. He was the center of their world, but a happy center, a sun around which they both orbited with joy. On their second wedding anniversary, James surprised Catherine by taking her to see a piece of property just outside of town. It was 20 acres of good land with a small creek running through it and a view of the prairie that went on forever. "I've been saving," he said, watching her face carefully. "Mr. Chambers is willing to sell this parcel at a fair price, and with what we've both put aside, we can afford it. We could build a real house here, Catherine, have room for a big garden and maybe some chickens. There's even space for a proper workshop where you could expand your business." Catherine walked the property with Thomas on her hip, imagining what it could become. She could see it so clearly, a sturdy house with wide windows, a barn for animals, maybe a few fruit trees. She could picture Thomas running through the grass, growing up with room to explore and dream. "Yes," she said, turning to James with shining eyes. "Oh yes, let's do it." They bought the land that month and began making plans. James and some of the other ranch hands would do most of the building work themselves to save money. Catherine drew up plans for the house, incorporating everything they had learned from living in the small rental. They wanted space but not excess, comfort but not luxury. A home built with their own hands and their own hearts. The house took nearly a year to complete, built slowly in spare hours and weekends. The whole town seemed to take an interest in the project, with various people contributing labor or materials or expertise. It became a community effort, a testament to how much James and Catherine had become part of the fabric of Abilene. When they finally moved in during the summer of 1877, 3 years after that fateful afternoon when a dust devil had brought them together, Catherine stood in the middle of their new parlor and cried happy tears. Thomas was nearly 3 years old now, a talkative, energetic boy who loved helping his father with chores and following his mother around her sewing room. He had a dozen aunts and uncles in town who doted on him, but there was never any question about who his real parents were. James and Catherine had built something special, a family bound not by blood but by choice and love and unwavering commitment. One evening in late autumn, as they sat by the fire in their new home, Thomas asleep upstairs in his own small bedroom, Catherine looked at James with an expression he could not quite read. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about what you said that first night about one being enough." James tensed slightly, wondering where this was going. "It is enough, James. Thomas is enough, and I'm grateful every day for him and for you. But I've also been thinking about all the children out there who don't have homes, who don't have families." She took his hand, squeezing gently. What if we didn't have more children of our own, but we gave a home to children who needed one? There are orphans in every town, James, children who lost their parents to disease or accidents or just bad luck. We have room now and love to spare. What if we shared what we have? James stared at her, his mind racing. He had not considered this possibility, but as soon as Catherine voiced it, he felt something click into place. "You want to take in orphans, not just take them in," Catherine clarified. "Adopt them, give them a real family, a real home. Not a dozen children. I'm not suggesting we become some kind of orphanage, but maybe 1 or 2 more children who need parents as much as we'd love to be parents to them." She searched his face anxiously. "Is that crazy? Am I being foolish?" James pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed with love for this woman who had survived so much and still had so much compassion to give. "It's not crazy at all. It's brilliant and generous, and exactly the kind of thing you would think of." He pulled back to look at her. "Are you sure, though?" "It won't be easy. These children might come from hard situations, might have problems or fears we'll need to help them through." "I know," Catherine said, "but we can handle it. Together, we can handle anything." And looking at her determined face, James believed her. They started making inquiries the next week. There were indeed orphans in Abilene and the surrounding area, children who had lost parents to cholera, to accidents, to the harsh realities of frontier life. The Hartleys made it clear they were looking for children who truly had no one, who needed a permanent home rather than temporary shelter. It took 3 months, but eventually they were approached about a little girl named Emma. She was 5 years old, her parents killed in a wagon accident the previous spring. She had been staying with a family friend, but that family was moving back east and could not take her with them. Emma was quiet and watchful, with tangled blonde hair and eyes that looked too old for her young face. When they brought her to meet Thomas, the little boy immediately tried to share his toys with her, chattering away about the creek and the chickens and his papa's horse. Emma stayed silent during that first visit, but Catherine saw the way her eyes followed Thomas, saw the hunger for connection beneath the protective shell. "Would you like to come live with us, Emma?" Catherine asked gently. "You'd have your own bed, and Thomas would love to have a sister. We'd take good care of you." Emma looked at James as if trying to gauge whether this was real, whether these people could be trusted. James knelt down so he was at her eye level. "I promise you'll always be safe here," he said simply. "And loved, always loved." Something in Emma's expression cracked and she nodded slowly. They made the adoption official through the local magistrate, and Emma became a Hartley. The first few months were challenging. Emma had nightmares and sometimes woke screaming for her mother. She hoarded food under her bed, convinced it would run out. She flinched at loud noises and cried silently when she thought no one was watching. But James and Catherine were patient, and Thomas, in his innocent 3-year-old way, was the perfect sibling, undemanding but constant in his affection. Slowly, gradually, Emma began to thaw. She started talking more, first in whispers and then in full sentences. She began to play with Thomas instead of just watching him. She let Catherine brush and braid her hair without pulling away. And one evening, about 4 months after coming to live with them, she climbed into James's lap while he was reading and said, "Tell me a story, Papa." James's voice caught on the first few words, but he managed to tell her a tale about a brave little girl who went on adventures, and Emma fell asleep in his arms. Catherine watched from the doorway, her heart full to bursting. This was what family looked like, she thought. Not perfect, not easy, but real and precious and worth fighting for. They had taken their pain, her inability to have more children, James's childhood trauma, Emma's loss, and transformed it into something beautiful. One child had become 2, and their capacity for love had only grown larger. The years continued to pass, marked by milestones and memories. Thomas started school and proved to be a quick learner with a particular talent for numbers. Emma discovered a love of drawing and would spend hours sketching the prairie, the animals, the people she loved. James built a small addition onto the house so the children could each have their own room as they grew older. Catherine's seamstress business continued to thrive, and she began teaching both Emma and interested women in town the skills her mother had taught her. They had hard times too. There were droughts that withered the garden and made money tight. Thomas broke his arm falling from a tree, and the doctor's bills were steep. Emma struggled with reading and needed extra help that required patience and creativity. But through every challenge James and Catherine faced it together, their partnership strengthened by shared purpose and deep love. When Thomas turned 10 and Emma was 12, the children asked if they could get a dog. James and Catherine exchanged glances and then agreed, and soon a gangly mutt named Rusty became part of the family. The dog followed the children everywhere, slept at the foot of Emma's bed, and greeted James enthusiastically every evening when he came home from work. It was one more way their family expanded, one more connection in the web of love they had built. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Catherine back to the boarding house where they had met. Mrs. Henderson still ran the place, though she was older and moved more slowly now. She welcomed them warmly and insisted they see the room where Thomas had been born. It looked smaller than Catherine remembered, more cramped and plain. But standing there with James's arm around her waist, she could still feel the echo of that desperate afternoon, could still hear her own voice crying out about not being able to have more children, could still remember James's steady response that had changed everything. "I was so scared that day," she admitted quietly. "I thought my life was ending. I thought I would be alone forever, that I had failed before I even began." James kissed her temple. "Instead, your life was just starting. Our life was just starting." They stood there for a few more moments, honoring the past, before returning to the present. To the children waiting at home with a special dinner they had prepared with Martha Patterson's help. The celebration that evening was loud and chaotic and perfect. Emma had made a cake that was slightly lopsided but tasted delicious. Thomas had picked wildflowers and arranged them in a jar. Rusty barked excitedly and got underfoot, and everyone laughed more than they talked. After dinner, James played his harmonica while Catherine and the children danced around the parlor, and when Emma spontaneously hugged her and whispered, "Thank you for choosing me, Mama," Catherine had to excuse herself to cry happy tears in private. Later, much later, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, James and Catherine lay in bed and talked about the future. Thomas would probably go to college someday. He was smart enough, and they were determined to give him that opportunity. Emma wanted to become a teacher, and they would support that dream however they could. They talked about maybe expanding the house again, about the possibility of taking in one more child if the right situation arose, about growing old together in this home they had built with their own hands. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Catherine asked. "About one being enough." James nodded against her hair. "I was wrong," he said, and Catherine stiffened until he continued. "One wouldn't have been enough. Not because we needed more children, but because I didn't understand yet how love works. I thought love was finite, something that got divided and diminished when spread around. But it's not. Every person we love, Thomas, Emma, even that ridiculous dog, just makes our capacity for love bigger. We didn't just have one child, we built a family, and it's the most magnificent thing I've ever been part of." Catherine turned in his arms to face him. "You're the most magnificent thing I've ever been part of," she said. "You saved me that day, James. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me what love really looks like. You made me believe I was worthy of happiness." James cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "We saved each other," he corrected. "And we built something neither of us could have built alone." They made love then, tender and sweet and familiar after 10 years of marriage, and fell asleep wrapped around each other as they always did. In the morning, life would continue with all its demands and joys. There would be breakfast to make and chores to complete and problems to solve. But there would also be laughter and love, connection and purpose, the daily miracle of a family that chose each other and kept choosing each other, day after day after day. Thomas grew into a fine young man, graduating at the top of his class and earning a scholarship to a university in Kansas City. Emma became a teacher just as she had dreamed, taking a position at the Abilene schoolhouse where she inspired a new generation of students. Both children returned home regularly, bringing stories and friends and eventually sweethearts. The house that had once seemed so spacious began to feel full again during holidays and visits, and James and Catherine loved every chaotic moment. When Thomas married at 22, he chose a woman named Alice who reminded James strongly of Catherine, kind, capable, and fierce in her loyalty. Emma found love with a young doctor named Robert, and their courtship was sweet and steady. Both couples stayed in Kansas, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to build their own lives. And when Thomas and Alice announced they were expecting a baby, making James and Catherine grandparents, the joy was almost overwhelming. The baby, a girl they named Caroline, arrived in the spring of 1888. James held his granddaughter with tears streaming down his weathered face, and Catherine watched her husband and remembered that young cowboy who had sat beside her bed 14 years earlier and promised that one child would be enough. He had been so earnest, so determined to comfort her in her despair. Neither of them could have imagined this moment, this fullness, this perfect continuation of the love they had started. "We did good, didn't we?" James asked later as they walked back to their home under a canopy of stars. Catherine squeezed his hand. "We did better than good, we did magnificent." And she meant it. From the depths of despair and abandonment, from a painful childbirth and a devastating diagnosis, from the chance meeting of two broken people, they had built something extraordinary, a family, a legacy. A love story that would be told to Caroline and whatever other grandchildren might come. A story about second chances and chosen family, and the courage it takes to believe in happiness when everything seems impossible. Emma and Robert married the following year, and they too eventually had children, twin boys who were absolute terrors and brought endless entertainment to family gatherings. The Hartley house became the center of everything, the place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations, and sometimes just because they wanted to feel that special warmth that James and Catherine had created. As they grew older, James's hair turned silver and Catherine's hands became marked with arthritis that made sewing difficult. but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by years of partnership and shared joy and weathered hardship. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the prairie they had called home for so many years, and James would play his harmonica while Catherine hummed along. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been there that day?" James asked once. "If some other cowboy had helped bring Thomas into the world," Catherine shook her head firmly. "I don't waste time on what-ifs. You were there, you stayed, you loved us when we needed love most, that's all that matters." James pulled her close, marveling as he always did at how perfectly she fit against his side. "I love you, Catherine Hartley. I've loved you for 20 years, and I'll love you for 20 more if God grants us the time. God, fate, luck, whatever it was that brought us together, I'm grateful for it every single day," Catherine replied. And that was the truth. From the moment James had knelt beside her bed and promised that one child would be enough, he had kept every promise, exceeded every hope, proven that love was not about what you could give someone but about showing up, day after day, and choosing to build something beautiful together. Their golden years were peaceful and full. Surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in the legacy they had created, James and Catherine Hartley lived out their days with the satisfaction of people who had lived fully and loved well. And when people in Abilene told the story of the seamstress and the cowboy who had found each other in the midst of heartbreak and built an empire of love, it was always told with reverence and warmth. Because it was more than just a love story. It was a testament to the power of choosing hope when despair seems easier, of building family through love rather than blood, of believing that sometimes one is not just enough, it is the beginning of everything that matters.